28. It is so good to see you this evening. For me, this week has kind of flown by. It only seems like 3 days ago that it started. But I appreciate so much the invitation, the elders to come and be with you. Some of you got that joke, by the way. I appreciate so much the invitation of the elders to come be with you, to be with Guide, with Daniel, be with members here at O'Neill, those who I've known for some time now, and to be with you again on this occasion. And of course, always good to be with Troy. Troy begged me to call him out this evening. So there it is, Troy. There's your call out this evening. But it is always good to see Troy. And appreciate all the words of encouragement you've given me this week. Let's start reading in Matthew chapter 28. Let's start reading in verse 1. Verse 1, Matthew chapter 28. Now after the Sabbath, as the first day of the week began to dawn, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to the tomb. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone from the door, and it sat on it. His countenance was like lightning, and his clothing as white as snow. And the guards shook for fear of him and became like dead men. But the angel answered and said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He's not here, for he is risen, as he said. Come see the place where the Lord lay, and go quickly and tell the disciples that he is risen from the dead. Indeed, he's gone before you to Galilee. There you will see him. Behold, I have told you." And so they went out quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy, and ran to bring his disciples word. Around 2500 BC, an Egyptian pharaoh by the name of Khufu ordered that a gigantic mountain of stone be erected over his tomb. When it was completed, the structure took up about 13 acres. It contained over 29 million cubic feet of limestone block. And when the last block was set in place, the peak of that structure towered 50 stories above the desert floor. We call it the Great Pyramid of Khufu. For the next 4,300 years, this pyramid was the largest, tallest man-made structure in the world. We may look at that and be in awe of it. But when grave robbers looked at the Great Pyramid, all they saw was a giant X that said, "Dig here." The builders knew that the grave robbers would soon make their way to this place. They knew that they would soon make their way into the tomb, and so they tried every archaeological or architectural trick in the book to try to prevent them from stealing the treasures inside this tomb. But without exception, the tombs and the pyramids were all looted and emptied. 2,000 years ago, just outside of Jerusalem, they discovered another empty tomb. This tomb held no gold, it held no silver, no treasures, no jewels. It only contained the body of a man from Galilee who had been crucified 3 days before. In our text here in Matthew chapter 28, some women have arrived at that tomb early in the morning. And when they get there, they of course go on to further prepare the body of Christ. But when they get there, they're shocked because the stone that had been rolled in front of the grave, the tomb itself, had been rolled back. And on that stone sat an angel. And that angel spoke 3 words which still echoes down the corridors of time. As they said, "He is risen." This text that I read reveals really 3 things about the resurrection I want to talk about. 3 things that we need to take from this text. First off, concerning the resurrection itself, it's a proven fact. It's a historical fact. That the angels invite the women to come and to examine the tomb where they laid him. Later, Peter and John get to that tomb, John chapter 20. They look in, and then finally they go inside the tomb, and there's nothing in there. There's no body in there. There's the clothes that he was laid in. There's a handkerchief that was on his face. That's all they found. Later, Christ will appear to Mary Magdalene. And that evening, he'll appear to his disciples. And a week later, he'll go back and he'll appear to his disciples again. And that time, Thomas is with them. And Christ invites Thomas to put his fingers in the nail holes of his hands and his feet, giving him the evidence that it's really him. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul names what? Names of people who saw Christ. He gives numbers of those who saw Jesus. Again, if you don't believe me, Paul says, go ask one of them. See if you can impeach their evidence, their testimony. You see, Christianity invites the examination of Jesus Christ and His resurrection. Christianity is not built upon some sleight of hand somewhere, some trick, some magic trick that somebody's pulled on others. It's a proven historical fact that Jesus Christ rose from the dead, and Christ invites us to look at the evidence. But secondly, the angel said, well, He's risen. Why? Because He said He's going to be raised, didn't He? Christ oftentimes spoke about His resurrection. Now, whether or not His disciples understood what He was saying, it seemed that they weren't maybe up to speed on that. But Christ oftentimes spoke about His resurrection. Matthew chapter 16, remember, He's with His disciples in Caesarea Philippi, and there He talks about building His church, And He goes on to tell them on that same occasion, He says this, that He began to show His disciples that He must go to Jerusalem, He must suffer many things from the elders, chief priests, and scribes, and be killed, but be raised the third day. Now, I wonder, they're listening to this, and did that just kind of just go in one ear and out the other? They didn't hear what He said there? Matthew 26:32, at the Passover supper. The supper is over. Christ said, but after I have been raised, I will go before you to Galilee. After I've been raised. Again, I'm thinking, what are they thinking? But probably the greatest statement concerning the resurrection is found in John chapter 2. John chapter 2 is the first Passover that we know during Christ's ministry that He goes to Jerusalem to celebrate. And so He's come there to Matthew, in John chapter 2. He cleanses the temple. You remember on that occasion? And really the Jews come to ask Him, hey, who gives you the authority to do that? What sign do you show to us since you do these things, they ask. And what does Christ say? Well, destroy this temple, in 3 days I will raise it up. And they're thinking, well, this guy's crazy. It took us 46 years to build this temple. You say we can destroy it in 3 days, you'll have it rebuilt? Of course, they don't understand what He's talking about. He's talking about His resurrection, isn't He? Christ states that fact about His resurrection. He really bases the entire claim of His deity upon the fact that He's going to be raised from the dead. But there's another thing that we need to take from this passage right here, and that is that the resurrection needs to be preached. The angel told the Marys to go and tell the disciples. Those Marys went and they told the disciples, and those disciples spent the rest of their life telling other people. At times when we get together as preachers, especially when I was at the Bible school, some mornings or maybe on a Friday morning, we're standing around there. What are you going to preach on this week? And somebody will say, well, I'm going to preach on this. What are you going to preach on? Well, I'm going to preach on this. You think the disciples ever got together and said, what are we going to preach on this morning? Can you think of what the apostles could have preached on that they personally saw Jesus do? Oh, Thaddeus might have said, I think Sunday morning I'm going to preach about the time Jesus fed the 5,000. That'd be a great sermon, wouldn't it? And James the last says, I think this week I'm going to preach about the time He healed blind Bartimaeus. And Peter says, I'm going to preach about the time He walked on the sea, walked on water. You think about all the things they could have preached. But when we find the recorded sermons of the apostles in the book of Acts, you know what they preached about? They preached about the resurrection. There are 13 recorded sermons in the book of Acts. 8 of those sermons are on the resurrection. 3 imply the resurrection. You see, when it came to preaching about Jesus, they preached the resurrection. Now, why? Why preach the resurrection? I'll tell you why, because that is the keystone, the cornerstone of our faith. Everything is built upon that. You ever thought about the fact that we could probably have Christianity without Christ walking on the face of the water? And that we could have Christianity without Him healing the blind Bartimaeus of his blindness? Or feeding the 5,000? There's a lot of things that we could have Christianity still without those things that Jesus did. But folks, we can't have it without the resurrection. Because everything we do is based upon that resurrection. We baptize because of the resurrection. We eat the Lord's Supper because of the resurrection. We're here this evening because of the resurrection. Everything that we do is about that resurrection, isn't it? And we should never stop telling people about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. If I mention the word mythology, what did you probably think of right off the top of your head there? I'll tell you probably what you're thinking of. You're thinking of Greek mythology, aren't you? You're thinking of Zeus and Hermes and Apollo, Poseidon. You go down the list of all those various gods. But you know, the English had their own mythology. I happen to like English mythology because English mythology is not based upon Hermes, Zeus, and all those guys. It's based upon the stories and legends of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table and Camelot. Now, according to the legends of King Arthur, he was to be the greatest king and was the greatest king that England ever saw. It was during their golden era. But near the end of his life, Arthur was shattered. His wife and his greatest knight had committed adultery. His nephew, Mordred, had pushed the kingdom into civil war. Half the knights of the Round Table were dead. The ideal of Camelot lay in ruins. And on the morning of the final battle, the deciding battle, a young boy shows up at the camp of Arthur. And he tells Arthur, I want to be made a knight. I want to fight for the realm. Can you make me a knight of the Round Table? And Arthur's kind of taken back by that. He asked the young boy, well, how did you ever hear about the Knights of the Round Table? And the young boy said, well, all the stories they tell about y'all. And then it hit Arthur. So long as there's someone to tell the story, there's hope that the ideal of Camelot would never die. And so he knights the boy, and then he tells the boy, you go back home, and you tell anybody that will listen to you about that brief, shining moment that was called Camelot. Folks, it is our duty to tell people about Jesus Christ. It is our obligations as Christians to tell others about the things that He did, the people that He touched, the words that He spoke. But primarily what we need to tell people about is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Because everything is based upon that. Well, that's great that Jesus rose from the dead. But what do I get out of it? How do I benefit from Christ raising from the dead? Let's talk about those things as we consider this lesson this evening. What do I get out of the resurrection from the dead? Well, I think the first thing that we get out of the resurrection from the dead is that it proves that we can be victorious over death. That there is victory over death. Now, we don't even like to use that word, do we? We don't like the word death. When someone dies, what do we normally say? Well, they've passed. Or we've lost them, don't we? We try to avoid using that word. Has anybody ever invited anybody over for coffee and cake and said, we're going to talk about death when you get there? We've never done that, have we? Because that's just a word that we just don't like to use. It's the word death. I think it was Rudyard Kipling on one occasion said concerning death that the Western world clings to the dread of death more closely than the hope of life. Bildad, one of Job's friends, called it the king of terrors. The writer of Hebrews said it's all about the fear of death that motivates and discourages people. For mankind, death is fearful. But that all changed the day that Christ came from the grave. You see, death is Satan's greatest tool. You know, it's not temptation because we're told we can resist temptation. And it's not sin because we're told that we can overcome sin. Satan's greatest tool upon mankind is death. And everybody is subject to it. Doesn't matter what race you come from, what economic class you belong to, what nationality you are, it doesn't matter your age. We're all under the curse of death. Paul says in Romans chapter 5 that death reigned from Adam to Moses. Man could do nothing about death until Jesus came. Turn Turn with me over to Hebrews chapter 2. Look what the Hebrew writer says about that. Hebrews chapter 2, look at verses 14 and 15 there. He writes that through death he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is the devil, and release those who through fear of death were all under the lifetime subject of bondage. Christ defeated death. And because he defeated death, we don't have to fear death any longer, do we? We don't have to be afraid of that, do we? Because he was raised, Paul says we're going to be raised. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 20 there. Now Christ, he says, is risen from the dead and has become the first fruits of those who are fallen asleep. The first fruits. Not the only fruits, but the first fruits. And what that tells me is that there's going to be second fruits and third fruits and fourth fruits and fifth fruits and all the way down. Because we who die in Christ will be raised to live with him. That's what the resurrection gives us. Victory over death. In fact, as Paul brings to a close there, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he kind of taunts Satan. He says in verse 55, "O death, where is your sting? O Hades, where is your victory?" Well, because Christ was raised from the dead, you see, there's no victory for Satan any longer. And we shouldn't dread death like we once did. Secondly, I believe there's a vindication that comes because we'll be raised. You look at the ministry of Jesus, and I was thinking about this on the way out here. Here's a man that healed people that were sick. He restored sight to those who were blind. He raised some from the dead. All the things that he did, and people hated him. Oh, he had multitudes following him, listening to what he had to say. But how many were assembled with the apostles there in Acts chapter 1? That you might say of the remnant, the faithful that were still going to follow Jesus. How many was there? 120. We got more than 120 here tonight. 120. The Son of God has come and been with us for 3 years preaching. And all he converted is 120 people. Because they just hate him. Isaiah said they would, didn't he? Isaiah told us in Isaiah chapter 53 verse 3, he is despised and rejected by men. John begins his gospel with this: he came to his own, and his own did not receive him. And throughout his ministry, the hatred just continued to build and build and build. And finally we come to John chapter 11, and the Jewish rulers said, we got to do something about this guy. If we don't, we're going to lose our place. The Romans are going to come here and take away our place. And so they devised a plan to have him killed. Now, it wasn't enough for the Jewish leaders to just take him out and stone him. That would have been the normal, thing they would have done. Just take out the guy and stone him. No. They wanted to completely humiliate him. That's what they wanted to do. And the way to humiliate a man such as that is to stick him on a pole. That's what the law says. Over Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 23 there. Let me read what the New International Version says there. It says, anyone who is hung on a pole is under God's curse. He's talking about crucifixion. They wanted to completely humiliate Jesus because they had utter contempt for him. But folks, the grave couldn't hold him. Couldn't hold him. And he was raised from the dead. And that's what Peter preached over in Acts chapter 2. To the very ones who shouted out for his blood, they are now his footstool. And he's been vindicated before them. Everything that he did, every place he went, every word he ever spoke, every great deed he did, it had been vindicated now before their very eyes. One day, those people who point the finger at us and call us names and say we're the dangerous ones. Those people who hate us and can't try to cancel us because we won't fall behind them in their perverted ways are going to see us next to Christ. And we'll be vindicated before them because of his resurrection. And one other thing I think that the benefit we get from Christ raising from the dead is really the value of hope. Stories told about a man who goes into a nursing home. Really, it's an elderly folks' home. And there were 4 elderly ladies sitting there in the lobby. He walks in, he's carrying a suitcase. And he puts the suitcase down and sits down where they're at. And finally, one of the little ladies speaks up and says, sir, what are you doing? And the man says, well, I'm moving in. And one of the other little ladies said, well, where you come from? And the man kind of looked down and said, well, to be honest with you, I spent the last 20 years in prison. Oh. Then the third little lady spoke up and said, well, prison? Why were you in prison? And the man again looked down and kind of murmured and said, well, I murdered my wife. Total silence. So finally the fourth little lady spoke up and said, oh, so you're a single man. Now some of you got that. I'm proud of you. That's hope. That's hope, folks. She saw hope, didn't you? We see hope because of the resurrection. It's the ultimate story of hope, isn't it? And there's no better example than with Peter, with the old apostle Peter. Luke chapter 22, verse 33, at the supper there, Christ tells him he's got to leave, what's going to happen. Peter says, Lord, I'm ready to go with you both to prison and to death. And Christ knew better than that, didn't he? He says, Peter, the rooster shall not crow this day before you deny me 3 times and that you know me. Oh, Peter, that ain't going to happen. But Christ knew that it was, didn't he? Sure enough, Peter denies him 3 times and the rooster crows. And the last thing we see of Peter in Matthew chapter 26 is that he's sitting in the shadows sobbing bitterly. The shame and guilt lay heavy on his heart. He had denied his Lord. He's washed up. He's lost all hope. Now, I read Matthew's account of that early resurrection morning, but over in Mark's account, there's something added there. In Mark chapter 16, verses 6 and 7 there, as the angel tells the women to go tell the disciples, he says this, go tell the disciples and Peter that he's going before you to Galilee. The angel says, I want you to make sure that Peter knows this. Make sure Peter understands that the Lord's going to meet him up in Galilee. Can you imagine Peter getting that message? That here's a man that last we saw was sobbing in the shadow. He's destroyed himself by denying his Lord. And the angel said, make sure Peter knows. And Peter got the message. The man who was once shattered now is filled with hope. It enables him 50 days later to stand up and preach about the resurrected Savior. A man who would write a letter to discourage Christians in 1 Peter there to remind them that the Lord is our living hope. You see, that's what the resurrection does. Now let me ask you this. What would you have done the resurrection day? You're Jesus. What would you have done? You've been raised from the dead. Would you have gone back to the Sanhedrin and marched in there and looked those guys in the eyes and said, well, you gave it your best shot, fellas, but you missed? Or would you go find Pilate and remind Pilate, hey, didn't you order my death? Well, I'm standing here, Anna. You missed also. Or would you go down to the temple area there where all the people have gathered together, the ones that cried out for your blood, would you stand up there and taunt them again because they missed? Is that what you do? You know what Christ did? Christ had a Bible study with 2 disciples on the way to Emmaus. That's what he did. And when they went back to tell the other disciples, they said that our hearts burn within us as he spoke. And they gave them this message that the Lord is risen. You see, that's what the resurrection does for us. Gives the hopeless hope. And never forget that. Well, the Passover is over. Jesus and his disciples will leave the upper room and make their way across the Kidron Valley up to up to the Garden of Gethsemane. In the garden, Jesus will pray, his disciples will sleep, and Judas will betray. They'll come and arrest him, won't they? Then they'll take him to a series of courts. They'll take him to Annas, to Caiaphas, to Pilate, where false witnesses stand up and accuse him of all sorts of things. It's Friday, but Sunday's coming. The verdict is death. And so they scourge him, put on a crown of thorns on his head, and spit him and mock him, and lead him off to be crucified. It's Friday, but Sunday's coming. They stretch him out and nail his hands to a beam, and then they place that beam on an upright pole and nail his feet to it. It's still Friday, but Sunday's coming. The sky will grow dark. The earth will shake. The great veil of the temple will be torn from top to bottom. And the Son of God will give up the ghost. It's Friday, but Sunday's coming. Then early one morning, some women make their way to the grave where Jesus was laid. And when they arrive, they see the great stone that had been placed over the entrance moved and an angel sitting on it. And the body of Jesus was gone. Why? Because it's Sunday, that's why. You know, before Christ came, all man ever knew were endless Fridays. But because he was raised from the dead, we too can look forward to a Sunday. Now I want you to remember that the next time you walk away from a grave of a loved one who's died in Christ. That right now it's just Friday, but Sunday's coming. Now let me ask you this. Do you have a Sunday coming in your life? If your life is taken from you this very moment, do you have a Sunday to look forward to? Or is it always going to be Friday for you? You need to change your life this evening. I'll ask you to come forward now as we gather, we stand and we sing this song.